Welcome back to Politics Tonight. So this week's top stories, a progressive alderman jumps into the race for mayor. And the mayor's response, a little less than stellar. Plus, a new poll says Governor Pat Quinn gaining serious ground in his re-election campaign, even amidst all the baggage of insults from his opponent. Of course, to break it all down, the Common Sense Caucus returns. Joining us right here in our WGN studios, Zorn. He's a columnist over at the Chicago Tribune and over at Tribune Tower, Chicago Tribune editorial board member Kristen McQueary. Welcome back, guys. Let's start with Bob Fioretti's entry into the race, second ward alderman, but they kind of took his ward away, so he's going to run for mayor. Several weeks ago, about 4% in the polls, up to about 26. Eric, let me start with you. Does Fioretti have any kind of chance here?
No, I don't think he does. I think what he does have a chance doing, though, is drawing out some of the more progressive voters in town. And if Karen Lewis runs, the two of them together probably would be able to hold Rahm Emanuel under 50%, which would lead to a runoff. I think he can play a spoiler for Emanuel here.
Kristen, your thoughts about? I mean, that really is the question. I mean, if there are two of them, and of course there may be many more in the race, but is the mission really just about keeping Rahm under 50 the first time around in February?
I think that's probably the likely outcome, but I would not count him out. I mean, this is someone who has had gotten his hands dirty in terms of the city budget. He knows it better than Karen Lewis. He has been independent. He voted against the red light camera renegotiated deal. He voted against borrowing $900 million in February. He's been really strong on ethics reforms and trying to maintain the powers of the Inspector General. I mean, he has truly demonstrated independence from Mayor Rahm Emanuel. He's not for school closings. He wants to support mental health clinics. So I think he has a lot of crossover appeal in the south and west sides where Mayor Emanuel is very weak and where people might be a little uncomfortable with someone like Karen Lewis, who is a union boss. I
would agree that he has some appeal, definitely has some appeal, and for the reasons that Kristen stated. I just don't think he's going to have the money. I don't think he's going to be able to get the donations together to mount a good campaign, whereas I do think that Karen Lewis is going to have a source of funds nationally and locally to actually mount a credible campaign against the mayor.
Well, it is all about Kristen, I'm sorry, but it is all about money, right? Rahm's got over $8 million, Fioretti about $350,000 in the bank, and Karen Lewis, there's a promise from the AFT for $1 million for her. Bob doesn't come anywhere near those numbers.
Right. I mean, there's no question Rahm is going to outspend and be able to put his message directly to voters through a lot of TV advertising. But this is going to be a race that is going to get a lot of national attention. It's going to get a lot of free attention around the city. I imagine that the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, we're going to be covering this race on a daily basis. So Fioretti is going to get a lot of free press.
Yes, and I'm really glad, by the way, that he's jumped in, and I'm really hoping that Karen Lewis jumps in too, because we really need a race. And I know we're going to be talking about the governor's race in a few minutes, but I'm really glad about a lot of the issues that are coming up in this governor's race also. That, you know, the one thing about politics, I mean, it's an ugly business and nasty and full of name calling and stuff, but it also focuses our attention on some very important issues. And I was afraid there for a while that no one was going to step up and run against Emanuel, because that does happen in Cook County and Chicago, where no one mounts a credible campaign. None of these issues get aired, and I think we're going to see that. And
Eric, let me just ask you, you know, he is talking about, that is, Fioretti wants a commuter tax. People who work in the city from the suburbs pay a 1% commuter tax, not a very popular thing. He does seem to be about finding ways to new revenues, and there could be some taxes tied to him. Will this be about issues, or will this simply be an anybody but Rahm kind of vote?
No, I think it'll be about issues. I think that a lot of issues will get discussed. I'm hoping that we have a number of debates. I'm sure we'll be talking about it here on the Common Sense Caucus all the way through January. So it's going to be, I think, a substantive campaign. I mean, right now, clearly we saw just this morning in the Sun-Times, there was an article talking about some of Fioretti's problems with his campaign fund last time around, and he's also being sued by some of his former law partners. So we're seeing that people are taking him seriously enough to try to knock him down a few pegs.
Let's move on and talk about the governor's race, since you had brought that up. And Tribune, a lot of polls all last week, and of course where Rauner was ahead in so many polls, out comes the Tribune poll and shows Pat Quinn significantly ahead of Bruce Rauner. 5% of the vote going to the Libertarian candidate, but even if you give Rauner the Libertarian votes, the margin of error, Quinn still wins it. Kristen, surprised with all of this NRA stuff going on and the other issues going on?
Well, as I've said before on this program, I don't think a lot of the scandal within the Quinn administration is really clicking with voters at this point. We did get more information today that in fact the Northern District of the U.S. Attorney's Office is subpoenaing records for that program. So we might see more scandal coverage coming, directed at Quinn. But I think Rauner's just had a few really bad weeks. I think he made some really bad miscalculations in thinking that voters were dumb enough to think that with all of this wealth, he still has his $18 watch, and he was just a little too schmaltzy. And I think voters are catching on to that. I think it's hurt him a little bit.
Actually, Eric, as you pick up on that, but let me just add in the Tribune question: who is more in touch with the candidates? And just like Kristen said, the respondent said Quinn is more like us.
Yeah, the only good that I can see in this poll for Rauner, the Tribune poll, is that conservatives have not come home to him at all. That some incredibly small percentage, of conservative voters are supporting Rauner. It's like under 60%, which for a Republican governor candidate is just not very good. I think that perhaps by the end of the campaign, they will come back to him. And he's got to hope for that, because right now, as you point out, that lead is outside the margin of error. I was very surprised to see it because all the other polls, as you pointed out, showed Rauner ahead.
Let's talk a little bit about, since we're focusing on these elections, I want to talk a little bit about the issues that people talked about. Minimum wage, millionaires, term limits. No surprise. A question I have for you guys here, and Kristen, I'll come to you. No surprise that people want millionaires potentially to be taxed more. They want a minimum wage. Is there anybody that thinks that these referendum on the ballot has anything to do with Legislator Springfield wanting to know what people think?
Well, I do think, I do see that Springfield is gearing up to enact some of these measures if they do get overwhelming support at the polls. I mean, the millionaire's tax, the way it would be phrased on the ballot, I don't know. I'm guessing 80% of people will support the millionaire's tax because it includes a component where the money goes to fund education. Who's going to vote against that? I do see that there could be legislation that emerges. So I wouldn't take these referendums too lightly. I could see the legislature during veto session in November actually coming back with bills.
It's for the children, isn't it, Kristen? It's always about the children.
Always for the kids, Eric.
No, I think that they will be. These referenda will gin up some voter turnout. Probably not a lot. But yeah, I wanted also to mention that just today the Rauner campaign put out an ethics blueprint. They've been putting out these blueprints periodically. I felt that it was the most substantive of the blueprints that he's put out so far. He made some specific calls for cleaning up ethics, and I do think that ethics is top of mind for voters in this state. They are concerned about honesty in their politicians or lack thereof, and they're concerned about people, turning around and becoming lobbyists right after they leave state government, and they're concerned about these guys who have law firms and they're making millions of dollars on the side while they're in the legislature. He hit those hot points today, and I think that this was a good day for Rauner in terms of that issue.
I would agree. I would point out that, well, one area where a lot of the pinpoints that he pointed to were in Quinn's Blue Ribbon Commission that he appointed in 2009, if you'll recall. He had Patrick Collins, former U.S. attorney, come out with a whole list of ethics reforms, and then Governor Quinn dropped the ball. He didn't pursue most of the ethics reforms that were recommended, and so he's vulnerable there. And now you have Rauner picking up on some of those, like the revolving door, like ending outside pay for legislative leaders and term limits for legislative leaders. And I agree with you. I think it's a substantive plan.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying I'm on board with all those things. I think the idea of not allowing legislators to work outside of the legislature, how much do they make a year? Not a ton, right? I mean, it's legislative
leaders, Eric, not legislators.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then I think I might be okay with that. But I'm thinking that you pointed out earlier, Kristen, that this neighborhood recovery initiative scandal and the Illinois Department of Transportation patronage hiring scandal, those things haven't seemed to grab voters yet, but they just might. I feel like Quinn really misstepped by not reacting more strongly to the Department of Transportation hiring scandal. He left 103 employees in place who had been hired through shady practices. I think that was a mistake. Rauner's been calling him on it. His response has not been very strong. So it's still a little early in this campaign for us to say that this ethics stuff against Quinn hasn't gotten any traction.
Yeah, Kristen, I suppose, I think even the auditor said, look, it's not these hirees' fault that whatever was going on, if anything. But don't you think Quinn would have been smart to just clear the decks and take the ethical course and just go, look, everybody's got to go. It's got to be done the right way?
Absolutely. I mean, I find it very perplexing that he went through the list and kind of cherry-picked who he was going to fire and who he wasn't, and left people on the payroll who were clouded and who do have questionable pasts. So it was a big misstep on his part to not fire all of them once this came to light.
Absolutely, should have fired them and offered them the chance to apply for their jobs again. I mean, if they are deserving employees and if they've been doing the job, then fine. I got no problem with somebody who deserves the job, who's been doing a good job keeping their job. But you know, you got to clean house when this kind of stuff happens. You can't do this halfway measure. And he left, what did he leave, 103 of them in place? That's just not right.
He did, and I mean, some of them applied for jobs before there were even job descriptions open, and so it was very clear that there was, you know, that there was favoritism going on.
A brief comment, Kristen, will anybody, when it comes time to voting, will anybody care about these ethics issues, or is it going to be about money and budgets?
It's never about budgets as much as I would like it to be, so I would say the issue is going to be who do I trust and who do I relate to more. That's, people vote for who they like.
And right now, Quinn is still winning that battle, I think. You know, he's still good old Pat Quinn, you know, warts and all, problems of the state and all. He's still the one who people know best, and I think they still trust him more. Clearly, the poll shows they trust him more than they trust Rauner.
All right, so it looks like the $18 watches and the old cars aren't working yet. We'll see whether he keeps making that effort. Eric Zorn comes over at the Chicago Tribune, and of course, Kristen McQueary over at the Chicago Tribune editorial board in the Tribune building, our Common Sense Caucus. Thank you for adding some common sense to this week's political events. Appreciate it. We'll see you next week, guys, and we'll be right back with more Politics Tonight. After these words, stay with us.